And we've focused in particular over the last year on questions of the humanities, biology, ecology, and the social sciences. But the title of this program is The Future of Civil Discourse, and as I'm sure you've read and seen and followed closely, there is a question in the American perspective right now: is civility dead? Have we lost a camaraderie, a connection to our collective humanity? And I think it's essential for media in the United States to evaluate its relationship geopolitically with other countries and other people, to ensure that the tenor and the quality and the presentation are critical, but are not offensive, are not further dividing people across geography, across countries. And I was interested in making the connection with Gerardo because his work is really focused on the preservation of animals and the preservation of clean air as the steward responsible for the implementation of the Endangered Species Act here. And if you think about that notion of civilization, at its core is our ability as human beings to see each other that way. And it's a distinction we have from animals to be able to rationalize and reason. And yes, we may have animalistic urges, as demonstrated by our president right now, but we have to transcend the animalistic because we have God-given capacity to dialogue. And so the program that I host focuses on how we, as representatives of different ideologies, different parties, how we can facilitate open dialogue. And the program was created 61 years ago now, to represent a venue, a place where free thought could occur uninhibited. I think it's important that we look at civility from that perspective of how we talk, our rhetoric, our behavior, and ultimately the public consciousness. You know, whether or not the public consciousness informs us is not simply about having the right information, having fact, having the correct perspective, but having the opportunity to debate, having the opportunity to deliberate, having the opportunity to discourse, have that kind of extended intellectual exchange, and it's not being represented in the American media adequately today. So as a representative of an alternative approach, which is called PBS, you can look at it, pbs.org. My show is called The Open Mind. It's theopenmind.com. You'll find an alternative because you may have lost some conviction or hope in the potential of American media to accurately and confidently address the serious issues in public policy. And when I think of that idea of civility, I think of incivility, because I think the American political experience right now has been toxic. And certainly we've had representatives of our politics, I think, malign people within our country, malign people outside of our country. And so if you think of the American experience right now, I would urge you to understand that a majority of Americans, I will speak for myself, but I think a majority of Americans might concur with the notion that there is rampant incivility. The incivility, I think, starts in a vicious cycle with the incivility of bigotry. The incivility of bigotry is the inability of people to view the ideas. Instead, they view the partisan labels: Democrat, Republican, nationalist, internationalist, and when American politics worked more effectively, and in fact when the discourse was more open, free, and encouraging civil society, we viewed each other first and foremost as Americans, not as Democrats, Republicans, liberals, or conservatives. So the incivility of bigotry, I think, is the incivility of not having the capacity to enter a deliberation because you view the person you're discussing a topic with, or a senator might be in the political context, as antithetical, opposite of your ideas. And if you have that bigoted idea, then you're unable to actually come to the table and have a discourse. And so that, I think, is the first in this cycle of incivilities that are hampering our discourse in the United States. If you think now about incivility, I think you think, to continue this cycle, about an incivility of dysfunction. If you're bigoted, if you engage in bigotry, and if you're unable to have thoughtful exchanges with people who might come from another state, who might come from another city, then how do you suppose you can have a functional conversation and deliberate in a functional context and have a functional society? And so, to me, the bigotry begets, evolves into a state of disarray or dysfunction. And ultimately, I think you have the incivility of obstruction or obstructionism. So if you start with bigotry, if you're bigoted, you can't engage in discourse, then ultimately you arrive at a dysfunctional state where members of parties are only talking to each other and not viewing the larger picture, which is their diverse ideas and attitudes, and you have to find ways to collectively manage them to serve the wider public interest. So if you have incivility of bigotry, you have incivility of dysfunction, you ultimately have incivility of obstructionism, or obstruction meaning legislators can't make progress. In some instances, Americans can't vote or don't vote. They are apathetic. They don't engage in the political process. And this is a vicious cycle that I think is undermining the very foundation of our distinction as human beings and our capacity, as Gerardo does most admirably in his institute, to preserve and protect and enshrine our environment and be the keeper of not only our fellow brothers and sisters, but the keeper of the wild and the clean air and water that enables us to perpetuate our own civilization. So this is not what you hear if you turn on most of the corporate media, and frankly any media across the world, because thoughtful deliberation does not equal ratings, dollars and cents that fund advertisements on television networks. I think since the election of Donald Trump, American journalists and their executives, so not necessarily the faces that you see on television or the ones you hear on radio, the voices you hear on radio, are becoming more cognizant that media play an enormously influential role in whether we perpetuate civilization or undermine civilization. And there's beginning to be that cognizance, that recognition that we can not only concern ourselves with who's watching or how many people are watching our programs, but we need to make sure that there is integrity in the way that editorial decisions are made, integrity in terms of the people producing and representing the news and the value of that news, and fundamentally that the content, the interviews, the social media, which I'll speak more at length about in a minute, but the production is not being generated as merely an engine of profit, but an engine of information, an engine of public utility. And that is my central challenge as someone who is responsible for not just hosting the show, but making it physically possible. by producing it, raising the money to make it actually available to households across the country, which it is on Sundays. You may have heard of the political shows in the United States or seen them on social media, Meet the Press or Face the Nation. Of course, we've had the CBS Sunday Morning News for a long time. The Open Mind is among, and I was very humbled and fortunate to take over for my grandfather, but we are among the longest running, oldest, and I would hope most venerable television programs in the United States. If you go to the Wikipedia page of the longest running programs in the history of American television, you'll find Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and The Open Mind. I mention this because it's still possible, even though what we view as a vicious cycle of incivility, or at least what I view as a vicious cycle of incivility in media, is the dominant experience. There are outliers. There are opportunities to present a contrarian perspective or an alternative approach that may be more informative and may have a different value system. Over the course of the American election, I traveled from campus to campus in the U.S. talking about what does it look like to re-envision or reimagine our political coverage and our journalism and our media so that we can separate the entertainment and the news. Because it seems to me that the phenomenon that led to Donald Trump's election was in part the blending of these very different forms of media, and the result being a skewed, maybe warped attitude that The Apprentice and the boardroom of The Apprentice somehow mirrored real life, or somehow was simulating the Situation Room in the White House. And we see now that that could not be further from the truth, because the way that this president has managed his administration has not shown his diligence or aptitude to take entertainment and move it into the political realm so that you can govern the country effectively. And as you know, he has a record low approval rating among any president of the 45 that have served in the United States. So it's a very precarious moment in American politics, because you have this person who was elected by an electoral college system that is not the popular vote. So more people voted for his opponent than voted for him. And so the will of the people is very much divided. And now, according to polls, there is a recognition among Americans that if there were an election today or tomorrow, he would perhaps earn 37% of the vote, which would not have been nearly enough for him to win in the Electoral College, because there have been studies of the states where he won, like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and at least in those states, public opinion has turned against him. And I do credit people in the Fourth Estate, that's our term for free press, but I'm sure there's a translation here. There is beginning to be a wake-up call, an alarm clock that I think inspires not just people in public media like myself, but people who are in corporate media, to remember that the news division should never be controlled by entertainment value, should never be determined by how many clicks you get. And I would say to close, before I answer your questions or Gerardo's questions, we as Americans very much value our relationship with Mexico and Mexicans. And I think that even I represent a journalist perspective, but I would say even if senior U.S. senators or representatives of our government came, they would absolutely contradict the president and not stand by, privately and some publicly too, the divisive rhetoric that has been directed at, again, not just foreigners, but Americans too. And I think that's important to understand. The wounds that have been opened through this election are not only directed at a particular religion or a particular ethnicity. They're directed at a diverse set of Americans who've had to experience, I think, the revival of racism and discriminatory impulse and perhaps even discriminatory decision-making that is attempting to wipe clean some of the social progress made during the Obama administration. And your voices, as some of you, maybe students here, I gather many of you are, I gather many of you are Mexicans, natives here enrolled in university. Your voices could not be more important or urgent. And when I'm in the States, I encourage students of journalism to, and all students, think about their role in, if Donald Trump is behaving in a certain way, he is one person on Twitter. I think that that kind of conduct should not be condoned, whether it's by journalists or by elected officials or by Americans. And if we together, as Mexicans and as Americans, combine our social media imprint and our digital energy, if we combine it, our example of civility, as opposed to what seems to be a dominant incivility in our politics, will overcome, will defeat, I think, what is a scourge of incivility, and will elevate diplomacy and manners, and a lot of that is dependent upon. I see some of you look like older millennials, as am I. Some of you may be younger millennials. Some of you may be Generation Zers. But it is this generation, because if this generation doesn't stand up to protect values and is simply hijacked into a social media culture that is very derogatory and can lead people to be dehumanized, then there is really no hope that we will recover our sense of purpose and that idea that we can be a positive example, and that ultimately that will become the majority that will be represented in our elected officials and our media and our culture at large. But it will not happen if we sit in apathy, if we are asleep at the wheel, so to speak, if we do not take ownership of social media in particular and harness our energy in ways that are productive, that may be civil disobedience, that may be protest, that may be political speech. But ultimately, I think we learn from our families, and this is where the biology comes back into play, from our families, from our parents, from our friends, that there's an American expression that might be, it may have its origin in Mexico because honey is a pretty significant commodity here, but you do make more strides with honey than with vinegar or with salt. And at the same time, there is no insinuation I'm making or no suggestion I'm making that there is some utopian future that awaits. There are real problems, economic and political. However, the tone and the civility of our discourse is what I think makes or breaks our capacity to continue as a robust civilization that is prepared to protect each other, to protect our environment, and to fulfill for the next generation that promise of a more just society. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention this morning and answer any questions that you or Gerardo has.
Well, first of all, thank you. Very, very interesting. I hope our audience get the main points of this, because it's rather frightening to understand what you are saying, that the breaking the disclosure, the civility of the disclosure of the way we engage in conversations and communication is one of what I can perceive one of the major threats to the continuation of civilization. And what I wanted to ask you, first of all, well, thank you, because I think your insights are incredibly interesting. And I'd like to ask you, being one of the few outlets of the free press in the United States, in this time of the bigotry has become so bad, and hate and racism and so on, what are the main threats, the main challenges that you face to continue your labor?
Well, it's always a challenge to find those people who want to make your work possible, who want to, in effect, be your sponsors or benefactors. We do not have major sponsors like a Boeing company or a major Fortune 500 company. Therefore, it's up to individuals, and it's up to individual benefactors to say that they want to support a media that has a socially conscious footprint, and that, yes, we're going to preserve the truth and say the truth, but we also have an obligation to ensure that the statements that come out of our broadcast, whether it's, you can find us probably most easily on Twitter and Facebook, facebook.com/OpenMindTV, and Twitter also OpenMindTV, but you'll see that the way we represent our digital engagement is to ensure that there is no hate, that different perspectives are represented. One example in Europe of, I think, a helpful model to consider in digital news is there are newspapers in Europe, and there may be ones here too, and in the United States now, that are requiring you to read an article, to have some base knowledge of the subject matter before you can comment. So you have to take a prueba, right, quiz, before you comment, because you know that commenters can be quite vicious. And the reality of the situation now is the comment sections in websites are not being driven by the idea of conversation or fruitful conversation that would produce some insights that the newspaper or a legislative body could then consider. Wow, these are very productive comments. No, quite the opposite. And frankly, you find people who are engaged in hate speech more than not, and I don't know if that's the case from Mexico newspapers and Mexican comments, but that's definitely a problem in the U.S. So that's an example of the kind of approach that I think needs to be extrapolated from a single television show that can only have so much impact, a weekly half-hour program with one guest. Gerardo appeared. We've had guests that you would recognize, of Bernie Sanders, for example. In the political sphere, Gerardo's peer in the United States, I would consider him probably the most famous climatologist is Jim Hansen. So we had Jim Hansen on our show too. These are the kinds of people who appear, who are practitioners. You know, they're rolling their sleeves up and actually studying or engaging in the issues, as opposed to a lot of people who are on American television now. It's like out of telenovelas. You know, these where do they find some of these, you know, baby commentators? I don't know if you agree with that assessment from the Mexican perspective. You know, that you see on the political shows. Who is this? It's lunacy. This person doesn't have any experience. They used to 5 years ago when they introduced someone on American cable shows, show the biography. So from 2000 to 2005, he or she worked for this campaign. Now they don't do that anymore. They'll just have the bio in one line. What's called the chyron, the bottom thirds of, for any of you familiar with the journalism and broadcast news. But to answer your question, I think I've certainly hosted people on the program with whom I disagree on some level. We've had Republicans, we've had Democrats, we've had Bernie Sanders. I think that during the campaign, the hosts of shows got so wrapped up in what was like trench warfare. You know, it was like grenades going off against Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump, that there was no attempt to salvage what was an unhealthy political experience. And having covered the presidential campaigns in 2012 and 2008, I was quite aware of the fact that it was getting worse. There are historians and commentators in our country, and I'm sure in your country too, who would say that America has always been uncivil. For God's sakes, we had the Civil War. That may be true, and it also may be true that the path to freedom for many Americans has still not been realized since the Civil War. But there was, I think since the Civil War and since Reconstruction, a unified purpose and commitment to the American people. And it's not clear through our politics that we have any genuine desire to serve the people. We have a genuine desire to win at any cost. And elections can be brutal. I know people who've run for elections. I know people who are office holders in the U.S. But I think that we should look to our brothers and sisters in some of the European countries, the French experience most recently, some of the Scandinavian countries they're doing democracy, but they're doing democracy a little bit differently. And it is not as it is not analogous to war. Politics is a way to dispute. It should be out of the construct of battle. There is battle in politics, but I don't think it should be designed to demonize people. And unfortunately, both of our candidates in 2016 had a lot of baggage, a lot of problems associated with them. So, I don't know if you play golf. A mulligan, have you heard the term mulligan? Well, give us one to get back on track in 2020. Presumably, Donald Trump will be running for re-election. He may not make it that far if he has to resign or is impeached. But I would urge you to give us a chance, because we need to get it back to normal democratic debate. Otherwise, we risk the deunification of the United States. And to answer the comment, or to respond to the comment that we have always been uncivil, it's a pendulum that swings, and there are heated, difficult debates in every society, and the goal is to resolve them without violence or without hate or without criminality. And I think we need to know that should be the goal. That should be the goal of the media. That should be the goal of the politicians. And right now, it's not clear that it's the goal of either.
But is there any hope, is there any way, is there an experience that you can go back in the pendulum to that? Because exactly in Mexico, we're facing exactly the same. I mean, if you are in the political arena, you're with me or you're against me.
Right.
And if you see in the social media, the comments, 99% of them are just really nasty words against the other people.
And you think that's true too in Mexico?
Definitely. In Mexico has become so polarized. You're on the left or you're on the right. There is not real discussion that will help the country to try to get it. I mean, politicians are interested in get elected.
Yeah.
And they do whatever they will do. And the people has been polarized. Not at the extreme, probably, yet, to the United States. But what I have seen, the same in Turkey, the same in India, the same in so many of the plague countries, there seems to be like a pandemic of the problem in the whole world. And I don't know if there is a way that we could, because as you say, there are half an hour program once a week, and there are so few outlets that can really still speak up and try to influence the whole place.
Well, I found it necessary, Gerardo, to form, I've just started to form a coalition of some like-minded journalists, and the purpose is to convene people beyond an individual TV show or study. And I think civic education is instrumental in providing an alternative to the garbage, the dirtiness of social media. And unfortunately, as I wrote in a forthcoming book, if you Google, I'm happy to send it to you and to your students. It's called A Documentary History of the United States. And it's a book that I now edit, that I continued from my grandfather as well, that he started, and I just submitted the text for the newest edition. And I note in this update, so this is the story of American history through documents, from Washington's farewell to the Obama inaugural addresses, and now we update it to include a Bernie Sanders speech, regrettably, some of the incivility represented in Donald Trump, as well as an important essay by Andrew Postman, who is a scholar of media, the son of Neil Postman, who's a very well-known scholar of communications at New York University. In this passage, in this update to this book, which will be available next year, I indicate that the social media largely derived from Silicon Valley and the U.S. long ago abandoned the idea that they were media companies, and only after the presidential election did they do an audit, in effect, release a statement to the public in the case of Mark Zuckerberg and his counterpart on Twitter, indicating that they will explore the problem of fake news, the problem of inaccurate information being disseminated on social media. Now, this is long after their creation. So this is a cancer that has been metastasizing for many years. And so, unfortunately, even a working group that I'm convening or multiple people may have limited impact. But it is important, I think, to realize that these executives abdicated their responsibility. They were utterly irresponsible in the way they managed the communications apparatus, and the body that would have been designed in America to regulate them, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was also absent. because ever since President Reagan, the FCC disbanded its regulatory mandate. And you can read about the history of that in this book, A Documentary History, or in Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. But that was a landmark moment in, if you want to understand why America, founded through the principles of Thomas Paine and the Declaration, founded through documents that were intelligent and had possessed some intellectual value and endurance, how we could evolve from Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson to Mark Zuckerberg and company. I mean, it's a devolution of the grade, of communications. On our show, we never want to underestimate the education, the educational value, or the intelligence of our audience. This is a rare thing. We overestimate it and want to be, proven that they are in fact equipped to know everything and more, and that, at the same time, our show does always start from the foundation, as I said before, the basics of any given issue, whether it's climate change or capitalism, or the connection between something like capitalism and climate change. But my point here are those that it's not just Donald Trump. It's the social media, the Facebook and Twitter culture that have enabled the deterioration of, I think, or the dehumanization of relations and, our core decency. And I don't have a magic bullet or any single answer to that other than you all realizing you're in our collective. Facebook and Twitter would not be possible without us. So at some point, a socially conscious entrepreneur is going to create an alternative to Facebook, an alternative to Twitter. Just look at the cycles of these companies, from Bell Atlantic to AT&T to Verizon to Facebook to Twitter. Of course, you had the interlude of MySpace between those two. But it is not impossible so much that the ship has sailed and that we are just now an indecent, intolerant world. And anyone who accepts that is the problem, part of the problem. I'm happy to open it up to
questions. Yes, exactly. I want to ask, is there any comments or any questions from you?
Yes.
What do you think of the outlets like last week tonight and the Daily Show? They're alternative to news media coverage, but they're a little bit more accessible to people?
They are definitely more accessible to younger people. I think the approach of comedy, the use of comedy to bring people into important discussions or teach them about discussions, we could not we should not undervalue the importance of those approaches. I do not know that Trevor Noah has had the same effect as Jon Stewart in sort of the. Although Trevor Noah has appealed to a cosmopolitan streak in his, so he's resonated, I think, with a more international audience than Jon Stewart was capable of reaching, and that's a credit to Trevor. But Jon, within the United States, had more impact, and you do ask yourself the question: would Donald Trump be possible without Twitter, without Jon Stewart? Jon Stewart, of course, retired the year before Donald Trump's campaign, and I think you're right to wonder, well, what was the impact of his absence? Would it have further engaged enough young people who had been involved in the Obama campaigns? So I think they're valuable. but right now their impact is more limited in constituencies that are already, we talk about silos or isolated blips or voting constituencies or reading or viewing constituencies. So they very much appeal to people who are already in those camps. And although I do think that humor and comedy, and there are comedians who've been of both political persuasions or numerous political philosophies, because comedy does have the effect of overriding political differences. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 2020, given the way that Donald Trump was able to use entertainment, culture, and his status from the NBC show that he did to elevate himself in the political context, I would not be surprised in the least if there is someone or multiple people who emerge from Hollywood, whether it's a comedian or someone like George Clooney or Tom Hanks or The Rock. I would not be surprised. Whether they win the Democratic nomination or run as a third party, as an independent party, that remains to be seen. Let me just make one comment, since I have expounded a lot on the American political experience. I think it's not just the fault of the Electoral College. It's, I think, the fault of the system and Americans unwilling to recognize the necessity of a third party in the U.S., a vital, competitive third party. Unlike in your last few elections and in many democracies, we have a partisan hierarchy that really prevents the emergence of credible third parties. And there are a lot of factors I could go into if you're interested that contribute to why that is the case, in that the Democrats and Republicans have only been competitive really since the early, I would say really since the 1910s and 20s. If you compare that to the elections of your last two elections, Calderon and Nieto, it's a very different experience. And I think that multiple parties do increase the process of democratization. They do boost the value of democracies and can strengthen the institution of free government. So, I don't know if yes. Can I answer in English? I could try in Spanish, but I would butcher it. Excelente. No, the response to the programs about science generally are positive, favorable but the reality of the climate science, and maybe this will change now with what's happened in Houston in the last week, but communities that are, we talked about this, and we talked about this with Jim Hansen, because Jim Hansen is from Iowa, which has not really been threatened like a lot of coastal cities and states by climate change. Or they have been threatened, but in ways that are not as visible to the public, the prices of crops, for instance. So my answer to your question is that if you were impacted by Sandy, where I'm from in the Northeast, then you're going to be engaged. This isn't sort of the nature of your question, because people write to me and will say, thank you for doing a show on the climate. I really valued it because of our family's experience in recovering from Sandy, which was billions of dollars of destruction. Not that dissimilar from Houston, in the sense that you see the photos of Houston. The part of downtown Manhattan was like that, and there are businesses that it really required 5 to 6 years just for a new business to take over in that area because the water had overflowed. So I find responses to be according to the interests or the geographic origin of the viewers. I know that's not necessarily what you would hope to hear, in that you would hope that there are problems and there are consensus responses. But as you were saying, Gerardo, there is diminishing consensus in America, or at least the way that social media. One thing to just recognize is that the way that we did a program on this recently, the way that bots and trolls, not fake news, fake people, have influenced social media and our perception is enormous. And whether or not that's because Russia wants to destabilize democracies across the country, across the globe, I don't know. I mean, that would be speculation. It might be a lot of, we've faced the threat of terrorism and extremists who've hit us in the U.S. and here too over the years that have political agendas or some that are just radically, radical hate-induced mission, which I would separate from politics. But we don't know whether or not this is a wave of represented by a state or a country, because on Facebook and Twitter there is seemingly like an infinite number of fake accounts that are trying to disrupt public opinion and lead you to think that there are wars of ideology, and that when you sign on, you're in the midst of a real battle for democracy or human rights or whatever it may be. So I don't know if the responses to our programs are caught up in this global issue of polarization, and the way you respond to climate science is going to be dictated by your zip code or your origin or your ethnicity. But I fear that. Yes?
How do you decide which topics in the area of biomedical sciences you select, you decide to work? How do you apply the question? By chance, I came to the media to talk about the disease that we're working on.
Mm-hmm.
In a program of show program, had a seizure and
Mm-hmm.
so that happened at 34 years. And since then, I've been more or less close to the media. They calling me to talk about this. And I think that although I am a scientist and working on the disease in different scientific aspects, I think that the control of disease is getting next thanks to the media. Because the information they obtain, they provide me the opportunity and to understand and to change. And how do you decide what topics to cover?
I'll answer your question, and then I have a question for you. The answer is, I want our program always to be pro-social rather than anti-social. So it is not always driven by the topics, but the people and their scholarship. I found Dr. Ceballos' work through an article on the Stanford website, which led me to his book, which I read and I thought was really important. I like our shows to have a trajectory. We've covered climate science and issues of you mentioned biomedical issues. We've also covered the issues of technology and medicine when it comes to finding a cure for cancer, but also the Human Genome Project. So his work intersected with some of the interests in how our program hopes to catalyze pro-social development, whether it's in the medical science or the scholarship. So to me, that's the criteria. If you have a scholar who is not really engaged in the public debate, then what is the purpose of that scholar or his or her work? If it, like you said, my question to you, what is, when you identify good information, a positive experience with sort of the democratization of information so that it's more accessible now, where are you finding reliable information? Right. Right, exactly. I view it the same way. It's a challenge. Yes, sir.
You representing the media, see after it from Facebook and Twitter, with this authorized of just virtual and just fast opinions. And how do you feel involved in that process? I mean, you are being the longest program in the United States. When do you see this change of the way of doing news and giving information?
Thank you. I was fortunate in that when I was in school, both high school and college and university, they were still publishing Encyclopedia Britannica. They were still actually reading. You would go to the library, and today, for the generation, you look like an educated audience and have more, like you are seasoned scholars, meaning you've had years, you've been to the library. Of course there are libraries at your university, but when I visit American campuses, the faces are much younger, more naive, I think, than this audience. This audience looks good. That's not always true in the sense that, there's certainly some American audiences that I think are still schooled through encyclopedias and articles as opposed to electronic media. But the electronic media has become quite pervasive, and we have to remind our young people here and there and across the globe about the value of discovery of information, because in this day and age, it is taken for granted, it is accepted that the information is visible immediately, and that may not actually be true. You might have to dig further into the story to understand what's happening. If you're asking how I manage it personally, I think being a student of both the print and the digital culture, having, before doing this TV show, written for newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, online, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post primarily. That gave me, I think, a strong connection to process. When you can so rapidly tweet, you don't have a connection to the process anymore. You just have a connection to the delivery and to the response, and then having to be responsible for, here are 1,000 people questioning me about my information. And that's not all it is. It is about the internal process of self-discovery, and through that reporting, the fact-checking and the delivery of information ought to be secondary. The authenticity and the genuine creation of the fact or the interpretation, that ought to be most important. So I would just say I think it is imperative that we value the process as much as the delivery. No, that means you're the best.
But, like, I don't know how much, like, the reach in the world, because
Billions, yeah.
about civility.
Yeah.
I'm recently thinking in Europe that they are making you read an article in order to comment.
Right.
But, I mean, does that really make a difference? Because, like, I know lots of people that love discussing, I have friends that love discussing stuff on Facebook, but they don't really do anything like
Real.
They don't get
they
engaged.
have no idea how things work. They never go to the real, they never interact with people. Everything is like on the web.
Right. The term in the U.S. that has been coined for this is slacktivism or clicktivism, hashtag activism, in the sense that it is not real life. You're not sweating and bleeding and feeling the real, urgency of the issues on the ground level. So, of course, I think it's important for you to have that human contact. Otherwise, you'll never really understand the nature. It is true that you can reach billions of people now through these social media. It's also true, I would urge you to look at a book by my friend Astra Taylor called The Populist Platform, or The People's Platform. She argues in this book that 10, 15 years ago, there was still hope that the internet would be this free and open place. Maybe even 8 years ago or 6 years ago. But her thesis is that celebrity culture, in effect, hijacked the promise of the internet to be an equitable place of exchange. And you know that by how many followers celebrities have, how many followers corporate media have. Now, there's been some rebellion against that in the form of people who are Trump supporters and say the mainstream media doesn't represent me. Also in the form of people who supported Bernie Sanders in the American perspective, that they developed their own media channels with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of followers on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. Let me tell you something. If I were my grandfather's vintage, if I were his age, I wouldn't be on social media either. In other words, if I grew up in that era, TV for him was like Twitter for us. But he was excited about TV. I'm excited about TV, not so much about Twitter and Facebook. It is a necessity because foundations and individuals who want to watch your show and potentially make your show possible through their donations, if you're not on Facebook and Twitter, you're nowhere, because that is really the international or global link, even within the states, different regions of the United States. So, people are not likely to write their editors anymore, write the New York Times, letter to the editor, or to picket their local TV station and demand that they fire someone or that they cover a certain subject, that they terminate someone who did something wrong, or they cover a particular topic that they're not. So I think that the answer to your question is that those people who you identify as your friends, who are active on the social media but not necessarily active in real life, in the real world, you should encourage them as someone who is not on social media but maybe is more engaged in the real world herself, to realize that you can't have one without the other. It is a bicameral process. Well, all of our shows are available to stream online, and it's a great question. I appreciate you asking that, because I think in my questions of guests or in my introductions, I will say to people, that I want you to read this, in that sense, there's only so much you can do. You know, you can drag a horse to water, but you can't make her drink. Is an American expression. I don't know. But in this sense, you know, you can only do so much to without relinquishing what you view as your job as a journalist. In other words, if you were saying, vote for this person or organize here with me, there is a question of, you know, whether or not that would be consistent with my values or my responsibilities as a journalist. And my approach with journalism is that I think you can be an activist. I don't consider myself a liberal or conservative activist. I consider myself a pro-social activist, a prescriptive activist, meaning that when I have a guest on the show, I believe that that guest is doing something to transform the world in a positive way. And it's up to the viewer, ultimately, although I wish all of our shows were public and viewers, you know, there was an audience. That's not exactly the way that TV works, but certainly when we interact with people on Facebook and Twitter, we're encouraging them to view the value of the show as, you know, you are able to take the next step from what Gerardo or whoever is saying and advance this cause or think about this further.
And I like to comment what you say, that if it's a word to do it, something in the other arena. Clearly, this is very important because I mean that most people is doing these click discussions, and they're not. It doesn't mean that they don't have a value.
Right.
What we're doing, and if they just control what is being discussed, then we're gone. We're lost. So I think it's very, very important that people like you, like us, that we can contribute with ideas, with comments, with experience, who are on the other side, without disrespecting them, because I mean they have their own value. It means that it will keep the balance. So as we say now, the threat is that become very superficial, very bigotry comments. What is really important now is that we understand that in places like the U.S., in these particular really hard times, in places like Mexico, where there were so hard times that we're having and so on, having a civilized discussion, not mentioning that these are so stupid, that these are so wrong because they don't think like us, is incredibly important to maintain the civil discourse that may help to maintain the civilization with the values that we are, that are fundamental values for society. So I think more than ever, it's incredibly important that we continue saying that saving endangered species, for instance, is critical, not just because it's inherently important to save those species, but because otherwise the future of civilization will be in jeopardy. So the answer is what you're doing and what we all can do collectively is becoming more and more important in the face of the massive threat of these superficial discussions.
I think it's kind of hard because, like, we can have a civilized, right, made by someone external from the, like a powerful someone of the system. Like maybe he's like really polite to us, but he's civilized, but
Well, there are a few shows that I've done recently on this subject. The idea that civility can actually perpetuate like a problem-ridden system or corruption. That may be true, but I think you have to incentivize, you have to motivate people to behave in a certain way in order to even have the legitimate grievance. Otherwise, I think it removes the legitimacy of the opportunity to have a legitimate exchange. But I hear what you're saying. I think you have to have a very clear definition of what civility means, and it's not just being polite. That's not being civilized. That's being civilized in one way, but not in total.
You can be very civilized, having very hot debates and very powerful debates. And many things that happen in Mexico, that the things that we have been able to advance in protecting the environment have been hot debates. But it's different to have a hot debate than to have a denigrating debate. So that's...
Yeah.
Professor.
Well, thank you. I thought you initially said tragedy, because it is a tragedy that all of our television that we consume, or much of it, not my show, but is blocks, right, left, two faces, and going at it like this, right, without any rhyme or reason, So I would first challenge this idea that we have to always have an exchange with two people from opposite perspectives. Yes, I think that's necessary, especially around a political issue. But it's in order for people to still be able to comprehend and learn and retain knowledge, the predominant form of just arguing with each other over boxes, squares on TV or in person, that so goes back to the cycle of incivility, the vicious cycle of incivility. To me, there may not be a strategy, to answer your question, to do that with two people who are already boxed into their bigoted or polarized ideologies. So we have to think about new models. Something that I propose, I was a fellow at a university in New Hampshire, in the Northeast, and the long political cycle in the United States begins in earnest with Iowa and New Hampshire, these two states that are very different from New York and California and Texas. I'm mentioning this to you because I want to answer your question about a strategy, to give you some potential alternative to, right? So the two states that vote first are Iowa and New Hampshire. I was based in New Hampshire, and with the local New Hampshire PBS station, we were working to develop a program that was going to be called Primary Dialogue, and we invited all the candidates, the Republicans and the Democrats, in a circular style, what we know as Socratic style discussion around a table. There is a model called the Friendly Seminar. Fred Friendly was a correspondent and an editor for CBS News. He was a president of CBS News back in the age of real newsmen and newswomen. And he and his wife, when he died, developed a program called the Fred Friendly Seminars. And the idea was that all these leaders, candidates for office or scientists, would gather around a table representing different perspectives and values. And you would simulate situations. It might be military leaders on an issue of political violence or foreign affairs, nuclear energy, whatever it might be, but there would be a moderator who was asking questions as if these events were really occurring, speculating on how would you respond to this situation. And the result of that was, and this happened, so the Fred Friendly Seminars were produced for about a decade or so, and unfortunately they don't have funding anymore. So that's the problem, right? The right strategies don't have the funding to amplify respectful discourse that is really challenging too, because the purpose of this was to get all these people, and the public would see how different elected officials or leaders would respond to criticism or would respond to points that they disagree with in this round table. And that's very educational and so different from what you see on TV. So that is one particular approach that I like a lot. Yes?
And it's related to this. I was wondering, how does the show or the show has an impact in the decision-making process at local level, also at national level?
It's also a really good question. We are a nationally distributed show, so we're available across the United States. We air on Saturdays and Sundays. And it's very hard for national shows, I think, today that are conversational in format to claim that they have impact. You know, we had this conversation, it led to a new Endangered Species Act in the United States. However, of course you get individuals who write to you or who write to the station, and sometimes they're not just writing to compliment or criticize you, to say something positive or negative. They're writing and saying, here's a book that I think would further advance this work, or will you come to my school, or can we come to your studio to view a show? So those kinds of suggestions and opportunities to further the discourse are important. And I don't think that only the result of legislation or political elections are the only outcome with a show. I'll give you one example, though, that I noticed, even though this is not something that was widely reported by any means. It's just my own reaction. I had Bernie Sanders on before he announced for president. And he was a senator. He was the longest-serving independent member of the U.S. Congress. And watching the show with him and then listening to him on the campaign trail, it was, to me, his experience on the show was really, it was an opportunity he used, I think, to reflect on what his campaign would be about and how he would discuss his campaign. And so that's valuable. His communications director said to me after our show that this experience was very positive. I think he meant for both the senator and his office. And from that perspective, it was quite gratifying to hear that it was an opportunity, like I said to you, sir, that self-reflection really has a value. The process has a value in and of itself. And so I know that some guests have told me explicitly, I came on your show and it clarified how I want to make this argument or the approach I want to take. Or I never thought about this question. For example, we have some shows coming up because we don't record necessarily every week. We do 3 or 4 shows over the course of a given recording session. So I spend one day at the studio, maybe from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., taping 1, 2, 3, and then editing those shows. So it's like 4 weeks of work in one day. Sometimes over 2 or 3 days, depending upon how much you need to edit. But the point is that I really hope that the guests on my show think before they speak, have the opportunity to really reflect, and that is not common in the media circus that we have come to know, that people really have the opportunity to think. In fact, you're trained in media relations. Don't accept the premise of the question. Don't answer the question. Say what you want to say. Now, if you're in a job interview, right, you're applying to be a student, PhD, whatever, I understand that, But if you're president of the United States, or you are candidate for president of the United States, you should not be able to use that trick in response to every question. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did through a year. He did not accept the premise of the questions. In fact, he created his own premises, his own fictional premises. So, it's very significant to me to have the opportunity for someone during these recording sessions to feel like they can think and analyze and go in depth. And that is different. There's 60 minutes. There are 1 or 2 other people on PBS with national shows like Tavis Smiley and Charlie Rose. But the difference between our show and their shows is that our show is really designed to be educational, civic education. And every guest who comes on, whether they're a scientist or an artist, a politician or a candidate for high office, I feel disappointed. I feel like I didn't do my job if I come away after that half hour or however long we're recording and say, this was not of educational value. People are not going to be able to learn anything because it was just talking points. It was just, part of the circus and not a cure or at least some effort to seriously address issues that are not being addressed.
Well, I think that's, you want, sorry. Yeah, yes, please.
Well, I don't think that the people who voted for Donald Trump are anti-science universally. I mean, I don't think that all of the people who voted for him would view, academia and scientific advances with disdain or distance themselves from what they view as like an elite. In general, I think that we have extraordinary universities that are like Gerardo's work here and also at Stanford. Climatologists, I know a couple of them personally, Naomi Oreskes at Harvard and Michael Mann at Penn State. These are examples of people like Gerardo and Jim Hansen who are continue to do their work independent of the fact that President Obama is not in office anymore, and the people who were advising science policy then had more rigorous approach and more, I think it's fair to say, a traditional educated scientific knowledge. And you hear now about appointments of individuals who are don't have real the requisite scientific experience or knowledge, and that's disturbing. It follows a trend of electing a president with no political experience, with no experience in serving the public good. So if you have scientists who are coming from the corporate world or not even the corporate world but just have no background in science, that's quite dangerous. I'm concerned about that as a citizen, as a journalist. But I do think that the defense or the firewall or the majority of people who are actually empowered to strengthen the work that was started in the Obama years and the scientific advances, those people are at leading universities that continue to have funding, that continue to operate. So I don't think that there is a long-term I don't think in the long term there will be a permanent change in the scientific community advising the country. I think that this is a moment where university scientists are going to be extremely important, and they need to hold accountable the government because it's not clear that the scientists employed by the government, or at least the leaders of the scientific organizations, have the interests of. But there are, I should say, there are the folks at the National Weather Service, for instance, or departments across cabinet level agencies. There are people who are lifelong geologists, for instance, who are still there, who disagree with some decisions being made at the top when it comes to chemicals and runoff water, for instance, but who are still engaged in the important analysis. And so that is really a difficult situation for the rank and file scientists to decide whether they want to stand by, continue to do their independent verification and analysis, even though they feel that the decision makers above them are going to corrupt it in some way, corrupt what they're doing. And I just want to say one thing, because I lost my train of thought before. When I was referring to taping shows, one thing that's different too about the questions and about the subjects of our program is we're always attempting to drive at some consensus. So one of the things that we're exploring now, as we think about the special prosecutor, Robert Mueller, who's investigating Donald Trump, is how can we arrive at a constitutional consensus and reassert the values that we think are important in preserving, protecting, and defending the United States of America and its Constitution and her Constitution. Because if we don't have political scientists and politicians who can come to some consensus that what Donald Trump is doing, if Robert Mueller proves some of his illegal behavior, is against the Constitution and the fabric of our being, well, those aren't democracies anymore when the elected presidents can get away with impunity, can get away with breaking the law. So we're about to find out, I think, in the coming months about the nature of the pardon power and the judiciary's check on the pardon power, because it would not surprise me if Trump attempted to pardon himself, and that would be I think that would be potentially a death sentence for democracy that the United States has not suffered since its inception. But I want to thank you all for being here. I hope that I was clear enough and that you took something away from this.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Alexander, for taking the time to come to talk to us and for you to be here. And I hope that you will be